This is Making Comics 101, issue 18, Covers. Greetings, people of the internet. I'm Scott with Serkworks Art Labs. Welcome, mad creators, to the underground laboratory where together we're going to create some awesome comics, because this is Making Comics 101, issue 18. Today we are talking about covers. So, cover design. What makes a great cover? Well, this is a really hard one, I think, to tackle. So I may be doing something a little bit different here. But when I ask that question, what makes a great cover, I think the main thing to think about is the best cover is one that's going to stand out on the shelf. One that's going to bring people in, because there's so many comic books out there. Comics aren't cheap relative to what they are, as far as what some would consider sort of a throwaway medium. Most people nowadays don't throw away their comics, but some people still have that idea. It's a collector's medium, and usually our pocketbooks can only allow us to collect so many things. So we have usually a limited budget for what we can purchase, and there are just so many options available. So having a great cover is super important if you want a customer to pick up that book. Whether it's in a comic book store, or whether it's like a virtual store, or even like a site where you download digital products, or whatever the case is, you need to have an awesome cover that is going to attract attention and invite people to want to pick up that book and take it home with them. So cover design is tricky, because you can have like a really nicely designed or well illustrated cover, but if all of the other covers on the shelf look similar, then it's not going to stand out. So it helps to be aware of what other books, especially books that are in your same genre, whether that's superhero, slice of life, you know, any particular genre of comics that you may be into that you're tackling. I think it would help to create something that's a little different than what normally you would see, and hopefully that will stand out. And there's not really any particular advice that I can give you on how to do this, other than just study what's out there and maybe find a way to design something possibly a little different, or something that, you know, we're going to get into a bunch of different examples, and I'll tell you why these might work or why they're successful. But if you look at the history of comic book covers, you're going to notice that some of the most famous covers, maybe they're not the best designed covers, some of them might be, but some of them just might have been a particular issue or an introduction to a certain character or something like that. So when you research best cover designs, they're not always the best design. They're usually the best sellers, and sometimes that can be because the cover was awesome, but not always. So having said that, let's dive into the first topic of this video, and that is going to be design. So when we're thinking about design, we want to think of the visual hierarchy. And visual hierarchy involves a number of different design elements that we want to think about when creating the design for a cover. Visual hierarchy, you know, is like size, color, contrast, repetition, proximity, white space, texture, style. All those things are things that we want to keep in mind when coming up with the design of our cover. Once we get into showing some examples, I'm going to point out some of these different design elements and tell you why they're effective. But before we get into that, I want to talk about some things that you need to pay attention to, or you need to allow for when creating your cover design. So this here is just a cover that I was designing. It wasn't an actual comic, but it was a print that was supposed to represent a comic page. So as you can see, we've sort of got all this information up here. There's no illustration yet, but these are things we want to take into account. Obviously our logo, we talked about logos in the last issue. We've got, you know, our price, we've got the dates, we've got, this isn't so necessary anymore. And again, this is sort of not a parody, but an homage to a particular style of comic. But we've got sort of this one says Galactic Comic Code Authority, whereas before it was the Comics Code Authority. But that used to be something that was mandatory if you wanted to sell comics on the newsstands. What I haven't allowed for here, which in this case is because this is a print and not an actual comic book, is a UPC code or an ISBN number. As you can see here, you know, this is sort of an older example, but I just want to point some of these things out. Of course, again, we've got the Comics Code Authority up here. We've got the publisher info. Most comics will have a publisher attached. You don't see this so much anymore as far as word balloons and all this copy and everything. That was very prominent way back in the day. But anyway, so back to what I was talking about. We've got our publisher information. Here again, we've got the name of the comic, even though it's right here. I'm not really sure about the significance certificates of that. You can probably not worry too much about that, but we've got our price, we've got our number, the comic issue number, the date that it's released, some copyright information, and then whatever other aesthetic you want to have that is on brand for whatever particular company is. Marvel, at this point in time, they had this masthead right here, and then they usually have this little box. This one's a little different. They've got the 3 character, or the 4, it's Fantastic Four, it's 4 characters, the 4 characters right here, and, but either after this or while this was going on, they also had this little box here. We'll talking about some of that stuff when we show some other examples. But again, we have room for this ISBN or UPC code right here. So those are just things you want to allow for. We don't have as much room for the art. You know, we can change things around. Nowadays, they've streamlined things a little bit. We don't have this giant masthead. We've kind of condensed usually some of the publisher information and all that. But yeah, so just take into consideration some of these other design elements that you're going to have if you want to be able to sell this, or just provide the necessary information that a consumer might want. They're going to want to know what number issue it is. You definitely have to have the price. I don't know if the date is as important anymore. That could also be inside, but you know, that's up to you. But there are certain things that you're going to have. If you're going to sell this like at a bookstore, sometimes in the direct market where it's just sold at comic stores, they blank this out, they remove it, or they put something else here. That all depends, but you do want to make sure you allow space for that. So when you're designing the artwork of your cover, you want to make sure that you're not putting any crucial information up here that's going to be obscured, or you want to leave enough room somewhere in here for that that UPC code or that ISBN number. Now, in addition to the design of our cover, we also want to think about composition. Composition is part of design, but we're going to kind of break it up, and I think the best way to do this is, like I said, just show some examples. Now, I don't have like some of the best-selling or most famous comic books out there in my collection, so if I mention any of those, I might just throw up a screenshot, but I'll try to make the best use of what I have, and through the examples that I have, hopefully we'll get a better understanding of what might make good composition for a comic book cover. So first off, if you Google best comic book covers, you're going to get a lot of the most famous comic book covers. Like, anyone notice this one? This isn't actually an original. No, I don't own Amazing Fantasy number 15, but so this is a very iconic comic cover. Just because it was the first introduction of Spider-Man. There's probably been a lot better designed comic book covers, but this is super famous because of that. So sometimes the most famous comic book covers are just because they've introduced a new character, something iconic happened in the book, or whatever. We get a good understanding introducing Spider-Man. Obviously, if this is the first introduction you've had to Spider-Man, really cool costume. Obviously, he's holding a villain of some sort. He's swinging. He's over the city. We pretty much sum up what Spider-Man is to its core. I mean, there's more to Spider-Man, that he's a teenager and he's struggling and all that stuff. We don't know that yet. We'll know that once we dive into this issue. But at first glance, this is a good introduction to your character. So if you're introducing characters, you definitely want to show that character in its best light. Sum them up as best you can on the cover with your cover art. Another very recognizable comic book cover. This is the trade, so it's a little different than the actual single issues, but you know, very well designed, very minimal. We've just got a shadow, we've got this lightning bolt behind us, and you know, we don't even have that big bold, you know, Batman logo. Just this very condensed type right here, but it is super attractive. And this, in the days, there really wasn't much out there like that. And this is what I'm talking about, is having something that's going to stand out on the shelf. First of all, this story was unlike anything that's ever been told before as far as a Batman story, but also just the design of it is something that stuck out, and that's why this is so iconic even today. Now, some comic books are famous just because of something that happened in the issue. Let's go back to the 80s again with Crisis from Infinite Earths. This was the death of Supergirl. This is so iconic because at least this incarnation of Supergirl stayed dead for quite a bit. Usually when you kill characters off, they just come back. Another one right after that, this is issue 7, and then issue 8, this is the final fate of the Flash. This was the Barry Allen Flash that died in here and stayed dead for quite a bit. For a while it was Wally West, but anyway, these are two very iconic comic book covers because of the death of a hero. You know, one comic that I have that I didn't put in there because it is probably still polybagged or something like that is the death of Superman, also a very iconic cover with just that cape flowing out, but also very famous because obviously the death of Superman. I don't think he stayed dead near as long as some of these other characters, but still a huge event. So those are some comic book covers that are well known because either they were a milestone or something crucial happened in an issue which kind of propelled the popularity of them, so everyone recognizes those covers. But now let's talk about the homage cover. You know, back in the day, this was Marvel Comics. Marvel Comics were far and away like the best-selling comic book publisher at this point, and probably still today, but I think by a long shot back then. But anyway, and just the look of a Marvel comic, it had its own look that you didn't see as much even in DC. A lot of type, a lot of stuff going on. And I have a suspicion that this is mostly because this was Stan Lee, and Stan Lee is a writer, not an artist, so he wanted to get as much of his words and everything in here. That's why you have so much of that. But because of that, that created this iconic look that you just recognize as a Marvel comic. We've got this little box. I don't know if there's an actual term for this. If you know what that is, let me know. But anyone could look at this and they could tell it's a Marvel comic because of this little square with the characters in it. The masthead, that did go away, and then it just ended up going over here. But this is something that is often homaged because it is so widely known. Here's some examples here. So this is a Tank Girl I picked up. Again, we've got sort of that masthead here. We've got the publisher. We've got the characters in that box. A little different down here. Still, you can tell that this is an homage to Marvel Comics. A comic book publisher that I am a big fan of right now is Alterna Comics because they kind of go back to that thing that made comics so fun when I was growing up, and that's having everything printed on newsprint, reasonable prices that people can actually afford. And because they're trying to go for that look, they have a very similar look to that Marvel Comics, and that is very much by design. So when you look at that, you get that nostalgia feeling. Another homage to a publisher that you see quite a bit, and that is the classic EC Comics. They publish like Tales from the Crypt, Weird Science, Vault of Horror, all that stuff. So as you can see here is what I did for the anthology cover for the 100 Days of Making Comics anthology, and this is very much meant to capture that feeling that you get from those old EC comics where you've got this boxy masthead. Here you've got the publisher information here. We've got these two little circles here, the page number, and then we've just got all new right here. Usually a little tagline, the main logo, and then right down here we've got sort of a square version of our main illustration. Here's another example. This is Phantasmagoria, which I picked up at a comic store. These are like Mexican folk tales, but it is also very much that EC aesthetic, a little bit different, but you can see with these circles that go right here. Oh, that's another element that I forgot to mention on this. Mine also has that. That is a big part of it, is these three circles, because there's usually like 3 stories involved. This one has a lot more stories. I wanted to keep it that look, so I'm not going to put circles for every single one. This one, I believe, only has those 3 stories. A friend of mine, Marshall Lee, created this print. I don't think he actually wrote the stories for it, but this is Attack of the Lizard Brain. As you can tell, you know, I bought this print. I actually also have the original right here that I got from Marshall. But you can see the look that he's going for, and you know, I just want to get the point across that this isn't copying. This is to pay tribute to. This is an homage when you do things like this. It's showing your appreciation for something that came before in the past. Unfortunately, EC isn't publishing anymore. People want to reconnect with that kind of stuff, so that's why you see so many of these homage covers. Now, homages can be done not just to represent what a particular publisher was doing at a certain time in their publication history, but also a particular issue. For instance, this is a very famous, often duplicated cover. This is Classic X-Men #1, artwork by Art Adams. You can see just this awesome group shot, and we'll talk about group shots in a minute, but this awesome group shot of the X-Men, and this has been homaged many times. The difference between just copying something that somebody's doing and paying tribute is to give attribution. So right here, this is X-Men Grand Design by Ed Piskor. You can see right here, there's no doubt about it, this is an homage to this Art Adams cover. And right here, even down here, it says Ed Piskor, and then it's got the date 2019, after Art Adams, 1986. So he's showing you right here that he's doing this in tribute to what Art Adams did. So if you're doing something like this, if you are kind of coming up with a design that's based on an existing cover, just put your name, the date, and then put after, and then whoever did the original artwork. Then there's no doubt that you are paying tribute and you're just not ripping somebody off. Now, the funny thing is, you don't even have to be a different artist to pay tribute to a particular issue. So again, X-Men, Classic X-Men, This is back in 1986, and here we've got the same artist, Art Adams. This is a print I picked up from Art Adams. It's actually signed by Art. He updated his original design. You see all the basic elements are there, but he kind of updated the character, the illustration technique. There's quite a bit more going on. Basically just improving it, modernizing it. And down here he says Art Adams, and then it says 9/10/2012 after Art Adams 1986. So he's even attributing himself. So I just thought that was kind of fun. So yeah, if you're gonna do homages, that's one way to do it. So you can do an homage cover to something that isn't even a comic book, to something in another medium. Take for instance this issue of Batgirl right here. Anyone recognize what that's from? I'll give you a minute. If you're not familiar, it is from Purple Rain, the Prince album, the movie, and yeah. So in the movie we had Prince on his bike and everything. I forgot who this figure was here. I haven't seen the movie. I've listened to the album many times. So here we have an homage that is to a movie, and I think this is done very well. It made a lot of sense because Batgirl rides a motorcycle and everything, to have Batman back here. But and also not only that, but her costume has a lot of purple in it. So this was just a great idea for a tribute to a movie poster. So going back to this classic X-Men cover, this is a perfect example of a group shot. This is something that as a kid really would get me to pick up a comic book. I mean, anytime I saw a bunch of characters like this in a pose, I think these classic X-Men were actually reprints of the original series after they started introducing characters like Wolverine and Storm and all those other characters. But to me, this just says first issue. We've got all our characters, especially with the team book. They're in cool poses and everything, and this is the kind of stuff I really like. And even like Young and the Dead, when I design the covers, I try to get that group shot to come across. Usually I've got a number of characters, and they're usually, I make it look like each issue could be a first issue, even though obviously they're not. But I took a lot from this, and you know, I'm not doing a superhero comic. My comic is just kids fighting zombies, so it's just a bunch of kids standing around in hopefully cool poses and stuff. Not as cool as superhero poses, but I am just a big fan of these group shots. Here is another example. Somebody who's great at this is George Perez. Take a look at this, and that's only the front cover. You open it up and it is a double page spread with just, I can't even count the number of characters. But when I saw this, I'd be like, wow. I mean, this is just made me want to pick up this comic just to study it, because you could sit here and look at this and for hours and not see everything that's going on or all the different characters. So I'm just in awe of how George Perez did this stuff. But the thing is, think about this. If every single artist took the time to draw all these characters and that's all you saw on the shelf, this book wouldn't stand out. The reason why it stands out is because there's so much going on. So again, we have to go back to what we're talking about in design and make sure that we're not just following a formula that everyone else is doing. So here's another George Perez example. This is Teen Titans number, or the new Teen Titans number 20. And this to me looks, even though it's issue 20, it looks like a first issue. It's crossed out, it says the original are back. So they're trying to get the idea that we're bringing back the original characters, so we want this group shot that all these characters in these cool poses. So you also want to pay attention to where you are in your comic book series. If you are trying to kind of reboot something and introduce a new idea, you may want to go with one of these sort of first issue looking comics, where if you're on issue 2 or 3, you may want to dive a little bit more into the actual story and what's represented in the story, and we'll get into some of that. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about group shots, or these sort of just iconic images. Here is Doctor Strange, Master of the Mystic Arts number 49. Not a particularly monumental issue. I would think 50 would be the big one, but if you look at this, this looks like it could be a first issue. I mean, that pretty much tells you what you need to know about Doctor Strange, and it's just sort of in this odd, you know, not really significant number. I don't know if anything happens in this, but I picked up this one just because it looks so cool. I had never bought a Doctor Strange comic before. I didn't know much about him, but and looking at this, I'm like, wow, that looks cool. It looks like a first cover, so even though it wasn't, it drew me in. It's like, this looks like something I might want to check out. I mentioned that visual hierarchy, and so I want to show some examples of some really good compositions, some good color choices. some comic books where they effectively use white space, all of that stuff. So here's an issue of Vietnam #1, and I really like this layout. This is artwork by Michael Golden. We've got sort of two scenes, but it's separated by the shape of Vietnam with the Vietnam flag here. Basically here we get our first introduction to our characters being just dropped out of the helicopter, and then sort of what's happening after that with all the explosions, and now they're in the thick of it. And it's just really nice how everything is kind of centered around this really cool visual design element. Here's a really cool example of a unique color choice. This is basically just 3 colors, black, yellow, and blue. This is Jim Mahfood's Generation X Underground special. But you can see very minimal, not a whole lot of colors, but because of that, this is going to stand out on the shelf. Also, it is printed very flat, almost like a screen print, and that is something that's going to stand out because it's different. Here's another example of a limited color palette and also a really cool design aesthetic. This is Avar Time Walker #1 by Valiant Comics, and just these circular design elements with the character in the middle in silhouette. We've got sort of 3 different scenes. We see space, we see sort of this world that looks like it's covered by lava, and then the cityscape. So we could tell he's sort of going through time, and it's just it just draws you in and everything. Even the masthead up here is unique. Everything about this is just something that's different, that's going to stand out. Very, more graphic design than illustration, but it's really appealing. So here's some interesting things that you can do. This is 2000 AD. This is the Eagle Comics #1. And I like this because this could be just the issue here, but we've kind of pulled out and we've got an actual character, some characters reading the comic book. And I thought that was really cool when I picked this up. I was just like, oh man, I love that idea. I think I even did my own version of a comic like that with somebody actually reading the comic. But just these unique elements that you don't see so often are something that can set yours apart on the newsstand. A lot of what draws us into comics are really cool, awesome illustrations, but even with the best illustrators, sometimes it helps us to pull back and do something, a little simpler. So this is Tribe Image Comics. We've got amazing artwork in here, but with the cover, we just went with a simple logo, and of course it's embossed and it's gold foil. In a world of all the other Image comics out there that are just known for that visual, in-your-face, action, characters, all that stuff, they decided to do something a little different, and that's one of the reasons why I picked this up. And it helps to include elements that people are familiar with. This is the one by Rick Beach. Obviously, you all know what that is, a Coca-Cola can with the one logo on it. Again, it's different, especially for the time. You didn't see hardly any of this, and I think he ran with this throughout. I think there was another one that kind of had the Tide logo. It was really innovative, and you don't see that much of this. Let's talk about another element of visual hierarchy, white space or negative space. I'm going to show you a bunch of examples. A lot of these are going to be from Alpha Flight, which is the first comic that I started collecting. It really got me into, loving comics back when John Byrne was doing it, and later Mike Mignola when he took over. But this is Alpha Flight #3, the character Aurora here. Now her costume is all black and white. Well, we've got these really cool design elements, and we don't see a lot of line here. Other than her face, everything is all black and white, and the logo. And it's just really striking, that use of sort of negative space. This cover really drew me in, and John Byrne did a lot of this interesting stuff that people really weren't doing so much back in the 80s. For instance, this comic here, this is Alpha Flight #6, Snowblind. There's a story that when this was illustrated, he was under this tremendous deadline. There was no way he was going to get it done or whatever. So half of the comic book towards the end is pretty much all like this, all done in sound effects and everything. So sometimes necessity is the mother of invention. You have this deadline, you know you're got to be able to draw all this stuff, so you create a story around it, and it's a compelling story, and eventually they come out of the snowstorm and you get back to normal and everything. But John Byrne was able to do something really unique with the story, and it carries through on the cover. I mean, obviously this didn't take him a lot of time to draw. It's basically this character, everything else is graphically designed, but amongst the shelf you're going to see this, and because it doesn't have all this other stuff going on confusing the eye, you're going to be drawn to it as well. So I really just love this because it takes advantage of white space. Here's a couple examples that they may be homages to that Snowblind episode. This is Whiteout by Greg Rucka and Steve Lieber. It is an Oni Press book, independent comic, and I think they made a movie on this, very similar to that Snowblind issue. And here's another one, and I don't know if this is, you know, some of this could just be coincidence, but I don't know. Here's a Spider-Man issue, kind of the same thing. These look very similar, so this could be an homage, it could be coincidence, but whatever the case is, they are taking advantage of that white space. Another element of visual hierarchy is repetition. Now, this can be something that repeats through your cover design, or it can be something that repeats through a series of covers. Going back to Alpha Flight, this is what did it for me. This is not the first comic I bought, but the one that got me to start collecting a particular issue, that really got me psyched about comics, because, and I'm going to give a spoiler for a comic that's probably about maybe 40 years old at this point. But this comic book leaves off with a teaser that one of the members of Alpha Flight is going to die in the next issue. So that just hooked me. That just drew me in. Spoiler alert, it was actually the leader, this guy right here. But the reason why I'm bringing this up is because look at this image. It may not seem as iconic as some of the other ones because it wasn't a super popular title like an X-Men or a Spider-Man or whatever. But we've got our main character kind of facing down. The villains here, the villains are all in shadow. We see our main hero Guardian in the foreground here. Then later on, you know, like I said, he ends up dying, and then he comes back. Now, there's more to the story. He doesn't actually come back. There's other elements in play. Interesting story, but here you can kind of see we've got that repetition. They wanted to connect back to this issue, so we've got some of the same elements, but it is in reverse. So there's some repetition here, but they're doing something a little different. They're doing the opposite. Whereas this one, we've got our villains here in silhouette, and our main character, where, you know, he's fully illustrated. Here's the opposite. And it makes sense because he's back. Who is he? You know, we don't, at this point we don't know if it's really him or what the case is. But we see all these. Oh, okay. This is a little different. Okay, so here it's not the villains. Here it's the heroes. Here he's facing the villains. Here's the heroes seeing him. Is he back? And again, spoiler alert, this ends up not being him. It is actually ends up being a villain. So there's that repetition, but there's also everything in reverse. I just find this very interesting the way they pulled this off. So this is the follow-up issue where the main character actually did end up dying. Issue number 12, it's a double-sized issue, and this has been heavily homage. I've seen, I think Liefeld did something like this in his New Mutants run. But what's interesting about this, you'll see this is issue 12. Now Alpha Flight, it's had a number of runs because it's one of those comics that just doesn't continue on. It'll start off and it'll have a following, and then the following kind of drops off, and then they'll cancel it. But they've done a run of Alpha Flight, I think 3 times. This was the first run, issue number 12. This is the second run, also issue number 12. You notice any resemblance here? This is the third run, also issue number 12. So within the history of Alpha Flight, every issue of Alpha Flight number 12 has had the same visual element. So there you go, that's repetition for you. Some other elements of visual hierarchy are style and texture. Now with texture, we can go back to some of those foil covers, those embossed covers. There's that kind of texture, but also texture in the medium in which it was created, and that also falls into the style. Painted covers are something you see a lot more of them nowadays. Before, there weren't so many of them, so when you saw something like this, like a Bill Sienkiewicz cover that's painted, this kind of stuff really stuck out to me, and this is when I started to become a big fan of Bill Sienkiewicz. Just because he was doing something not only because it was painted, but because his style was so unique to anything else I had ever seen. And you'll also note his use of white space. There's not a lot of background and everything, so there's a lot of those visual hierarchy elements working within this one cover. Now back in the golden age of comics, there weren't a lot of painted covers. There was one comic book publisher, Gold Key, which produced a lot of painted covers. Most of their covers were painted, and it was in a time where you just didn't see a lot of that. And because of that, they were able to capture sort of that niche, and you could look at a Gold Key cover and say, oh, that's a Gold Key comic because it was painted. It kind of had the aesthetic of the old pulp novels, which you didn't really see so much in like the Marvel and DC and the other publishers, what they were doing at that point in time. It's not even the medium. It's the medium, it's the style. Like I said, the texture, the white space, proximity, alignment, repetition, contrast, size, all that stuff. And one other thing that I want to talk about is color. So another modern comic book series that I am just in awe of the covers is Oblivion Song, Robert Kirkman, written by Robert Kirkman, illustrated by Lorenzo De Felci. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. As far as color theory goes, this is a perfect example. So, you know, you've got this green and the red, which are on opposite ends of the color wheel, contrasting colors, and it just, bam, it's just beautiful. Very limited color palette once again, but it's all carried in through the logo, and this is a continuous thing. Again, here is another. The orange and the purple creates such a striking image, and it just goes on from there. Look at this. Every single one of these covers, not only the design, but the illustration and the color choices they use, I look at this stuff and I'm just like, wow. Not only that, but the graphic design is just brilliant. So this kind of stuff drew me in. Another comic book series that handles colors beautifully is Paper Girls by Brian K. Vaughan and Cliff Chiang. There's not a lot of colors, but each one just sticks out. We're dealing with two colors, one on each issue, and it's this repeating, you know, format, this look that goes through all the comics. But when you look at this, it stands out on the shelf because it's different than what else is out there, and you know it's very well branded. You know a Paper Girl comic cover when you see one. All right, I have one more example to show you that I saved for last because I think it sums up a lot of the different elements that we talked about, and that is Lamanno Ste Destino by Jay Gonzo. I saw this at a convention. I immediately picked it up. I think at the time he may have had 3 issues, so I picked up those 3 and I kept coming back to see if he had new issues. So I've been collecting. I think there's one more that I don't have, but obviously, as you can tell, look at the color scheme. He's using the same color palette throughout, and it's brilliant because it's almost these neon. It's not quite neon because you would have to do that as probably spot colors, but it's very close. It's just got this bright look to it. So it looks fresh, but it also has this sort of homage look to it. I mean, all of these elements are things that we've seen in past comic companies. Some of this, even, I think Gold Key kind of had this thing here. Also, EC Comics would have this little thing over here as far as the publisher information. Whereas for him, he put the name of the comic in English here. It's got a lot of type and everything. It looks like it's screen printed. It looks like he may have added a little bit of effects to make it look a little weathered here. I don't think, because this is a fairly new comic, but it's just really striking. Each issue, it's telling a story on each one of these issues. Man, I just can't say enough good things about, you know, the design of the series, but just really well designed and something that is going to stand out because it's different. And like I said, that's the thing that you want to think about when you're designing your cover. You want it to stand out. You want it to be something that people are going to be drawn to. There's so many different ways to approach the design of a cover, but hopefully all these examples are going to make you better prepared for when you do go to design your cover and give you some ideas and maybe some inspiration for what kind of covers you can create, how to approach them. And yeah, that's going to do it for today's episode. This was a fun one. Happy I got to share all this stuff with you, and I will see you guys later. That is all. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like what you saw and you want to see more, hit that subscribe button. Also, you can follow me at Serkworks on social media, and now you can support the work that I do on Patreon. Do you like making comics? Then go to Serkworks.com and pick up the Comic Maker Starter Kit. It's packed full of fonts, brushes, templates, and more, and best of all, it's totally free.